Defeat seemed inevitable, until ruthless human soldiers entered the battle. The fourth defensive ring was gone. Not retreating, not regrouping, gone. I had the numbers in front of me, and I read them 3 times, not because I misunderstood them, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain I was reading them correctly. 61% of coalition ground forces on Chorus VII had been removed from effective combat status in 17 hours. The Eastern Corridor, which we had spent 9 weeks fortifying, lasted 40 minutes against the first Shroud advance column before the commanders there stopped sending reports. They stopped sending reports because there was no one left to send them. My name is Vale San. I have been a field marshal in the Cathari Coalition for 41 years. I have watched 3 civilizations end. Not decline, not fall, end. The way of fire ends when there is no material left to consume. I know what the final phase of a planetary siege looks like. I know the particular quality of silence between weapon impacts when a defending force has shrunk too far to maintain continuous fire. Chorus VII had that quality of silence. The Shroud had not announced their arrival. They never do. They had appeared at the edge of sensor range 14 days ago, a fleet of 92 vessels arranged in the geometric formation their species uses not because it is tactically elegant but because it communicates something specific. It says, "We are not in a hurry. We have done this before. We will do this again after you are gone." We had called for coalition reinforcements on day 2. On day 7, the Coalition High Command sent 11 warships and 4 ground divisions. Good soldiers, brave ones. The Shroud had processed them in 36 hours. On day 11, High Command sent a message instead of ships. It used phrases like strategic reallocation and prioritized defense posture. Those phrases mean, "We have decided that this situation cannot be recovered, and we have stopped trying to recover it." I filed an acknowledgement and returned to my work. There was a young officer in my bunker. Thessaly, 3rd-year field grade, sharp enough to understand that the situation was not survivable and inexperienced enough to still be looking for the angle that changed that. She sat at the secondary communications panel and watched the sensor feeds with the focused attention of someone searching a document they have already read twice. "The human carrier group has confirmed transition," she said. I did not look up from the casualty figures. "Humans," I said. I should explain the Shroud for anyone not familiar with the kind of enemy that removes tactical options rather than simply presenting obstacles. They are not cruel in the sense that implies pleasure in suffering. They are methodical. They identify a resource-bearing world. They neutralize its defensive capacity in the most energy-efficient sequence available to them, and then they extract what they need. They have been doing this for, by the best available archaeological estimate, 800 years. The worlds they process do not have ruins afterward. They have sites, locations where biological and geological material was converted into Shroud industrial output, with a thoroughness that treats a city and a mountain as variations of the same resource category. Chorus VII had 17 million inhabitants. I had sent the civilian evacuation order on day 3. The Shroud had closed the viable exit corridors on day 5. They do not let the material leave. The sensor feed updated. The human carrier group had breached the outer blockade. I looked up then. Not because of the breach itself, ships attempt blockade runs and fail regularly. What made me look up was the accompanying data. The human carrier group had not navigated around the blockade perimeter. They had gone through the center of it, the direct route, the one with the highest density of Shroud interdiction fire. Their lead vessel was reporting hull damage to 4 separate sections. They had come through anyway. "How many soldiers?" I asked. Thessaly checked. 200 ground personnel, 11 dropships. 200. I had 3,400 soldiers still in effective status on Chorus VII, and that number had been enough to buy 17 hours of ground defense against a force that should have already finished. 200 additional soldiers would shift my survival probability calculations, by a margin that was, mathematically speaking, almost impossible to distinguish from zero. "Commanding officer," I asked. "Colonel Dara Yusuf," Thessaly said. "Ninth Human Rapid Response Group. She is requesting coordinates for a landing zone." I gave her the secondary landing field behind the third bunker line. Then I stood, straightened my uniform, and went to meet the people who had come to stand here with us. The dropships came in hard and fast, not the careful angled descent that minimizes exposure to ground fire, straight down, with the entry profile that shortens landing time at the cost of everything else. 3 of them were trailing smoke when they touched the ground. They touched down anyway. I stood at the edge of the field and watched the ramps deploy. The humans came out in formation. The speed was the first thing that separated this from what I expected. They were moving before the ramps finished extending, spreading into defensive positions around the ships in the time a standard soldier needs to finish reading a deployment order. They moved like they had already decided what to do before they arrived. The last figure down the ramp from the lead ship walked directly toward me. She was shorter than my species by a notable margin. Humans are soft-bodied by any physiological standard of assessment, unprotected external tissue, accessible joint structures, calcium-based skeletal framing. She stopped in front of me. "Field Marshal Vale San," she said. Her translator rendered her voice with a flat, precise quality that I suspected was not fully accurate to her actual tone. "Colonel Dara Yusuf, 9th Human Rapid Response Group. Give me the current tactical picture." I gave it to her, all of it. The casualty figures, the lost corridors, the shroud formation analysis, the projected timeline to total perimeter collapse. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. Her eyes moved in a way that told me she was not just receiving information. She was reorganizing it around some internal framework I did not have access to. Then she asked one question. Not what are the withdrawal options, not what is the current survival probability, not what does High Command authorize. "Where are they thinnest?" she said. I showed her the map. I indicated the western approach, the shroud's heaviest concentration, the anchor of their entire ground operation, the location that any rational tactical assessment identifies as the place to avoid at all costs. She looked at it for 4 seconds. "Good," she said. I adjusted my grip on my command tablet. Thessaly, standing behind me, asked very quietly whether the humans had been briefed on the current survival probability estimates. I told her I had not shared those figures with Colonel Yusuf. Thessaly asked why. I watched Yusuf walk back toward her soldiers, already directing, already pointing, and around her the humans were moving with a quality I spent the next several hours trying to find a precise name for. Not urgency, not confidence. Something closer to inevitability, as though they had already determined how this ended and were now simply filling in the remaining details. Because, I told Thessaly, I am no longer certain those figures are accurate. The humans had 1 hour before Yusuf said they would move out. 1 hour. My forces had been in continuous engagement for 17 hours with established supply lines and prepared fortifications, and a combat unit deploying 60 minutes after landing from a carrier group that had just taken significant damage breaching an active blockade would normally be flagged as operationally unrealistic. I did not flag it, I watched. The first thing the humans did was not what I expected. I had anticipated the standard deployment sequence: weapons check, equipment distribution, command briefing, the process that every military culture in the coalition follows in some variation. The humans did all of that, but they did it simultaneously in overlapping clusters that looked, from a distance, like disorder and was, I gradually understood, nothing of the kind. 2 soldiers distributed ammunition, while a third updated them on a map briefing at the same time. 4 others checked each other's equipment with an efficiency that had moved well past requiring conversation. Near the second dropship, a pair worked on a technical modification to a piece of equipment I did not recognize, their hands moving with the certainty of people who know exactly where every component belongs. And in the middle of all of it, some of the humans were making sounds at each other. My translator identified the sounds as humor. I logged this. I did not yet know what to do with it. Yusuf came to me at the 40-minute mark with a list of requests: additional sensor data on the Shroud command structure, current positions of my remaining ground forces, the layout of the civilian shelter corridors. That last item stopped me. The civilian corridors are in the Eastern District, I said. The western approach you identified is the Shroud anchor point. There are no civilians in the Western District. They were moved to the Eastern shelters on day 4. Right, Yusuf said. I need the layout of the Eastern shelter corridors. I gave her the data without asking why she needed it. A part of my tactical assessment had already started forming a theory, and the theory had the quality of arriving correct and uncomfortable simultaneously, because it required me to revise an assumption I had been operating under for 17 hours. The assumption was that the humans were here to help defend what remained. They were not here to defend what remained. They were here to take back what had been taken. The distinction is not small, but I had been processing everything through a framework built on 17 hours of managed retreat, and that framework does not naturally generate the category counteroffensive launched by 200 soldiers against a Shroud ground force of 40,000. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of imagination. I was still recalibrating when Yusuf returned to her unit and the final preparations began. I watched the change that comes over a military formation in the minutes before deployment. My own soldiers go through it, the tightening of attention, the compression of expression, the point at which individuals become a single coordinated system. The humans underwent a version of it I had not seen before. They became quieter, not silent. There were still voices, still the sounds of final confirmations and last equipment checks, but the quality of sound changed. It went from the energy of active preparation to something lower and more concentrated, the way current runs underground rather than overhead. One soldier near the second dropship sat down on the ground with his eyes closed. He sat like that for approximately 90 seconds. No one disturbed him. When he stood, he moved directly to his deployment position as though the pause had not happened. I asked Thessaly quietly what that was. She said she did not know. I watched him. He was young by human standards, not as young as Thessaly, but carrying the particular quality of someone who had not yet settled fully into his form. His hands were steady. His eyes, when they were open, moved across the landing field with the careful, systematic sweep of someone confirming something specific rather than simply observing. He did not look afraid. He looked focused in the way I have only previously seen in soldiers, who have done the precise thing they are about to do many times before. I found this unsettling. I filed it. Yusuf came to me at the 55-minute mark. We will move through the western approach to the Shroud command anchor at Sector 9, she said. When we break their command coordination, their formation structure will fragment. I need your forces ready to push through the gaps when that happens. I told her that the Shroud command anchor at Sector 9 was protected by their heaviest ground concentration, and that a unit of 200 soldiers moving toward it would be reduced to an ineffective size before reaching the objective. What size do you estimate we reach it at? She asked. I ran the calculation. Approximately 60 soldiers, assuming optimal performance at each engagement point. She nodded. That is enough. 60 soldiers against a Shroud command structure, protected by 40,000 ground units. I had been fighting wars for 41 years. I had never sent 60 soldiers to accomplish what that implied. I said nothing. I was not certain what to say. Your forces need to be ready at 300, Yusuf said. Not moving at 300 ready, so that when we open the gap you can move in the same breath. I confirmed. She looked at me for a moment. You think we are not coming back, she said, not a question. I think the probability, I began. I know the probability, she said. I ran the same numbers before we cleared the blockade. She said this without particular weight, not resignation, not a performance of bravery. It was the tone I use when confirming a fact I have already incorporated into my operational planning and moved past. She went back to her soldiers. I stood at the edge of the field and watched the final preparations complete. At 200, the humans moved out into the dark. I want to be precise about what it looked like. It looked controlled. The kind of movement that reflects extensive practice, not of this exact situation, because no one rehearses this exact situation, but of the underlying skills this situation required. The humans went into the dark in a spread formation, maintaining spacing with the automatic regularity of something that had become reflex rather than conscious decision. The young soldier I had watched near the dropship was third in the column. He looked back once, not at me, not at the landing field, not at anything I could identify as significant. 1 second. Then he faced forward. He did not look back again. Thessaly stood beside me. Should we do something? She asked. Make sure our forces are ready at 300, I said. We went inside. I sat at the command station and watched the sensor feeds update as the human unit moved west, and I prepared my soldiers for an order to advance that I had, as of 90 minutes ago, completely stopped believing I would ever give. The display showed the Shroud Western anchor. 40,000 ground units organized around a command structure that had been systematically eliminating coalition defense points for 17 hours. The display also showed 200 small thermal signatures moving toward it through the dark. I watched them move. I watched the distance decrease with each sensor update. At 2:37, the Shroud concentration began to register weapons fire from inside its own perimeter. I leaned forward. I read the sensor data 3 times. The humans were already inside. They had not fought their way in from the outer boundary. They had moved through gaps, through overlapping patrol patterns, through the specific geometry of a formation designed to hold a perimeter against an external threat, which had therefore created a kind of internal logic that could be read and navigated by someone who had spent enough time studying it. Thessaly made a sound beside me that my translator declined to classify. I checked the time, 2:37, 23 minutes before my forces were supposed to be ready. I opened the command channel. Be ready now, I said. Not at 300. Now. Because I had just understood something I should have understood the moment Yusuf asked where the Shroud were thinnest, instead of where they were weakest. Thinness is a gap, weakness is a target. She had not been looking for a place to attack. She had been looking for a way in. The sensor data from the Shroud Western anchor stopped following recognizable patterns at 2:41. Not because my equipment failed, because what was happening inside the Shroud perimeter had stopped conforming to the patterns my equipment was designed to read. Shroud ground formations move in structured configurations, columns, flanking arcs, concentric defensive rings. The software that translates raw sensor data into tactical display is built around those known patterns. It assigns meaning to movement based on established Shroud operational behavior. At 2:41, the Shroud inside Sector 9 stopped moving in those patterns. They were reacting. There is a difference, and it is not a subtle one when you have spent enough years reading combat data. A unit executing a plan moves with internal consistency. Each element relates to the others in predictable ways because they are all following the same operational logic. A unit that is reacting moves in fragments. Individual elements respond to immediate local threats rather than coordinating with the whole. The internal consistency breaks apart, replaced by a dozen separate decision points all running at the same time. The shroud western anchor was fragmenting from the inside out. The human thermal signatures were distributed across 3 separate locations inside the shroud perimeter. Yusuf had split her 200 soldiers into at least 3 groups on entry. Each group was operating independently, which meant each had its own objectives, which meant Yusuf had built a plan before she arrived that required information she did not have until she landed, and she had designed it to be adaptable in the time between landing and deployment. I have worked with the finest tacticians in the Cathari coalition for 4 decades. I have never seen anyone build a contingency plan that assumed the contingency would be resolved on schedule. The comms channel registered an open line from the human unit. A voice, male, controlled, with the specific vocal pattern of someone speaking while managing significant physical exertion, reported from Group 2. They had reached the secondary command node at Sector 9's inner ring. They were setting charges. They needed 4 minutes. 4 minutes in place, inside the heaviest shroud concentration on Chorus VII, while the surrounding force searched actively for them. The channel acknowledged and went quiet. I watched the thermal display. Group 2 held the position. The charges went off at 2:51. The secondary command node went dark in the display, a gray marker where an active indicator had been. The shroud coordination signal dropped by a measurable percentage, not enough to break their operation, enough to introduce a delay into their response cycles. In combat, a delay is a resource. Group 1 reached the primary relay at 2:53. The coordination signal dropped again. The shroud western anchor, 40,000 ground units, began the specific movement pattern that my software did recognize, because it was a known shroud behavioral response. Reorientation sequence. They were redirecting attention from the eastern perimeter, where my remaining coalition forces were holding the last defensive ring, to the western interior, where 3 groups of humans were systematically removing their command infrastructure. I opened the command channel. "All units," I said, "push east to west through the gaps, move now." Thessaly looked at me. "Now," I said. The coalition ground forces moved. What followed was not a clean military operation. I want to be accurate about this, because accuracy matters more than the version that reads well in official records. Clean operations have clear lines and defined objectives and units that perform their functions in the proper sequence. What happened on Course VII from 2:53 onward was a coalition advance through a shroud formation that was simultaneously too large to have lost its effectiveness, and too internally disrupted to apply that effectiveness with coordination. My soldiers took losses in that advance. I watched the casualty updates cycle through the display, and I did what 41 years of command has trained me to do: keep reading, keep directing, keep moving. But the line moved forward. For 17 hours before the humans arrived, the line had done one thing: it had contracted. Every hour less of Chorus VII was under coalition control. The mathematics pointed in a single direction. Then the line moved forward. I watched my units push through the first gap, a section of the shroud formation near the western corridor, where the internal disruption had caused units to pull back toward the command anchor. A gap that had not existed 4 hours ago. A gap that existed because 200 human soldiers had gone into the dark toward something the probability calculation said was unsurvivable. Thessaly said something I did not fully catch. "Say again," I said. "They're sonic communication systems," she said. "The Shroud Sonics, Group 3 is using them." I looked at the relevant sensor feed. She was right. The Shroud deploys sonic disruption as a standard area denial tool. The frequencies impair neural coordination in most species, including Cathari. It had been contributing to our losses for 3 days. You cannot coordinate a defense when your soldiers cannot maintain reliable neural function long enough to execute coordinated movement. Group 3 had located the sonic emitter array inside the Shroud perimeter. They had decided the correct response was not to disable it. They were broadcasting Shroud disruption frequencies outward from inside the perimeter, toward the Shroud outer formation. The Shroud communicate chemically. Their sonic systems are external tools, not biological functions. The frequencies they deploy against other species do not affect them. The humans would have known that. They would have known that broadcasting Shroud disruption tones at Shroud units would not harm them. What it created was a zone of dense sonic interference centered on the command anchor, which meant the Shroud units surrounding the anchor, trying to coordinate a response to the human activity inside, were now working inside the same disrupted communication environment they had been using as a weapon against my forces all week. It did not disable them. It made them slower. One of my unit commanders reported through the channel. His formation had crossed the second gap. The Shroud units on his flanks were present, but their response timing was degraded. He described moving through a crowd that knew something was wrong but could not reach agreement on what to do about it. I confirmed the report and told him to keep moving. The comms channel from the human unit registered another open line. Yusuf. Marshal. Her voice had the same controlled quality, but behind it there was something, the specific vocal signature of someone speaking while managing physical demands. We need 15 more minutes inside the command anchor. Hold your advance at the second line until we are clear. Understood, I said. Current status. A brief pause. We are doing our jobs, she said. The channel closed. I looked at the thermal display. The 3 human groups were still active inside the Shroud perimeter. Some signatures had stopped moving. Holding positions, I determined, providing cover so that other members of their unit could complete objectives. I thought about the young soldier from the landing field. I could not determine which signature was his. I told my commanders to hold at the second line. Then I did the thing that 41 years of command experience tells you is not a productive use of a senior officer's time during an active engagement. I watched the thermal signatures, I counted them, I kept counting. The 15 minutes Yusuf requested became 22. During those 22 minutes, 3 things occurred that I will record in the order they happened. The first, the Shroud outer formation attempted a flanking maneuver through the eastern sector, toward the civilian shelter corridors. It was a clean tactical move. If the humans inside the perimeter had committed to a fixed position, this maneuver would cut off my coalition forces from the civilian shelters and the 17 million people inside them. It would have eliminated the strategic reason to hold Chorus VII at all. Group 3 had already moved to block it. Not after the maneuver began. When the maneuver began, as though they had anticipated it before it started. Later, I reviewed the tactical logs and found the detail that explained this. The Eastern Civilian Shelter Corridor data that Yusuf had requested during the landing field briefing. She had not needed it for offensive planning. She had needed it to know exactly where the Shroud would apply leverage if the ground situation shifted. She had assigned Group 3 to that approach before her soldiers ever entered the Shroud perimeter. She had seen this move 2 hours before the Shroud made it. The flanking maneuver was stopped at the corridor entrance by 11 human soldiers. They held that position for 19 minutes. I watched the sensor data, and I did not have a word for what I was observing, so I kept watching. The second thing, one of my coalition unit commanders, Calvin, reported that his formation had reached the inner cordon, the edge of the Shroud anchor's central defended zone. He was requesting authorization to push through. I told him to hold. He reported that the shroud units in his sector were showing significant response degradation. He said that if the humans could create one more disruption inside the perimeter, a single coordinated push from his formation could reach the command center itself. I told him to hold and be ready. He acknowledged. I watched the display. The time was 3:02. The third thing, weapons fire from inside the shroud perimeter intensified sharply at 3:04, then stopped. Complete stop, no gradual decrease. One moment the sensor was reading active exchange, and the next moment it was not. Yusuf's voice came onto the channel. Command anchor is down, she said. Move your forces through now. I turned to the command board and opened the full channel. All units, all sectors, I said, push through full advance. I want to describe what happened in the next 40 minutes accurately, because what I observed in those 40 minutes changed the way I understand the relationship between preparation and outcome, between probability calculations and the decisions of individuals who have chosen not to be limited by them. The shroud formation, 40,000 ground units, the most disciplined and methodical military force I had encountered in 4 decades of warfare, fragmented. Not all at once, not in the dramatic way that looks like a sudden collapse. It fragmented the way a wall develops cracks, here, then there, then the cracks connecting, the structural logic failing from multiple points simultaneously until the whole thing ceases to function as a unified system. Calvin's unit reached the central command zone at 3:18. He reported the command center structures were already disabled. The humans had been thorough. He reported finding evidence of 3 separate simultaneous operations having been conducted inside the zone, evidence that spoke to exactly the kind of careful, coordinated planning that was supposed to be impossible to execute with 200 soldiers inside 40,000. He also reported something else. He reported that the humans inside the command zone were ready to move, not regrouping, not resting, already repositioning for the next phase. Calvin described his first face-to-face encounter with Yusuf in the following terms. She looked like someone who had finished the first item on a list and was already thinking about the second. I moved forward from the command post at 3:21. I had not left the bunker in 11 hours. The battlefield I entered was not the one I had been monitoring through sensor displays. It was louder, more disorganized in its specific physical details, with the particular quality of a situation that has shifted faster than the surrounding environment has caught up to. Shroud units that had been cut off from their formation were responding in ways that were harder to predict, because they were no longer operating according to the command signals that had been directing them. My soldiers were handling it. The gaps the humans had created were being held and expanded. I found Yusuf at the edge of the inner cordon, directing her remaining forces with the same focused quality I had observed on the landing field, as though the hours between then and now had been a routine professional exercise, rather than continuous combat inside the most fortified position in the enemy's operational structure. She had taken a wound to her left arm. A field bandage had been applied. She was using both hands. I stood beside her and said nothing for a moment. You did not tell me you were going inside the perimeter personally, I said. You did not ask, she said. She directed 2 soldiers to a position along the cordon, turned to survey the eastern approach. Her eyes moved across the terrain in the same systematic way I had observed in the young soldier on the landing field, not general observation, specific confirmation. Your line is holding, she said. It is advancing, I said. She allowed herself, for the first time since the landing field, a single brief change of expression. It was small. It lasted less than a second. I had watched enough of her people in the past hours to know it was not a performance for my benefit. It was internal, a private acknowledgement. How many did you lose? I asked. Too many, she said. She meant it. The weight in those two words was not performance. It was the weight of someone who has already begun the accounting and will not finish it until the last possible thing that can be done is done. And yet you are advancing, I said. We are always advancing, she said. I did not ask her to clarify. I already understood that she was not talking only about Chorus VII. A soldier came toward us at a run, young, the one from the landing field. I recognized his movement pattern before I recognized his face. He came to 3 meters from Yusuf and stopped. Eastern corridor is fully secured, he said. His breathing was controlled, the kind of control that requires significant effort to maintain. Groups 2 and 3 are consolidated and ready for redeployment. Yusuf nodded. Get them water in 10 minutes, then I want them on the northern approach. He acknowledged and turned back the way he had come. Yusuf's eyes followed him for half a second longer than the exchange required. I noted this, I understood it, I did not mention it. The Shroud outer formation began its tactical withdrawal at 3:39. Not a rout. The Shroud do not rout. It was a structured, disciplined backward movement of a kind I had considered categorically impossible for this enemy in this phase of an operation. My casualty board updated. The numbers were significant. My soldiers had paid a real cost for every meter of ground recovered. I looked at the numbers. I looked at the sensor display, which now showed the Shroud formation contracting rather than expanding for the first time in 14 days. Chorus VII was not saved. Not yet. The Shroud had not left the system. Their fleet was still in orbital range, and they were disciplined enough to recognize a setback without treating it as a defeat. But the mathematics had changed. I ran new calculations. I ran them 3 times. 71% survival probability. I had not seen a number that high in 4 days. I did not trust it. I ran it a 4th time. It came back the same. I looked at Yusuf. She was already coordinating the next phase, already thinking 2 steps past the thing we had just accomplished, already moving forward. I thought about the question I had been carrying since the landing field and had not yet asked, about what to call the thing she did, the quality of motion and decision that I had been unable to name. I had 41 years of experience, and a vocabulary built across 41 species worth of military culture. I did not have a word for it. I decided I would ask her when there was time. Dawn came to Chorus VII 6 hours after the Shroud command anchor went down. The orbital sunrise was the same as any other light crossing the atmospheric boundary at the angle this planet's axial tilt prescribed, falling on terrain that had been producing and sustaining life for 400 million years. The light did not know anything had happened. It came in the same way it always had. Below it, Chorus VII was still standing. The Shroud had withdrawn to a holding position at the edge of orbital range. Not gone, their fleet remained, disciplined and patient in the way that speaks to an enemy that has calculated a temporary setback and is already constructing the next approach. Coalition relief forces were 4 hours out. The Shroud knew this too, and were factoring it into whatever determination they were currently making about whether the resources on Chorus VII still justified the operational cost of extracting them. That calculation had changed in the past 6 hours. That calculation had changed because of 200 human soldiers, a 1-hour deployment timeline, and a colonel who had arrived at my bunker asking where the enemy was thinnest rather than how to survive long enough for someone else to solve the problem. I stood at the edge of the landing field in the early light and reviewed the full casualty accounting. My coalition forces had taken significant losses, heavier in the advance phase than I had projected. But they were alive, holding ground. The units that had been in continuous defensive engagement for 17 hours were now in consolidated positions on terrain that, 12 hours ago, had been in Shroud control. The human unit, 61 soldiers in effective status from the 200 who had landed. I read that number twice, not because I misunderstood it, because I wanted to understand it correctly. 61 from 200. That was the cost. That was what the past 6 hours had required from a group of people who had already come through a blockade run with hull damage to 4 sections, who had already run probability calculations that said they were not likely to return, and who had deployed anyway in 60 minutes and gone into the dark toward the heaviest enemy concentration on the ground. I went to find Yusuf. She was in the primary shelter building, the one closest to the landing field, sitting at a folding table with a paper notebook in front of her. She was writing by hand, methodically, one line after another, with the same focused economy of motion she applied to everything. I stood at the entrance until she looked up. "Marshall," she said. "What are you writing?" I asked. "Citations," she said. "Commendations for the personnel we lost." She was writing them by hand, on actual paper carried from Earth, through the blockade run, through everything that had happened in the past 6 hours. "Why paper?" I asked. She looked at the notebook for a moment. "So it is harder to delete," she said. I sat down across from her. Through the open entrance of the shelter building, I could see the landing field and the remaining dropships, and beyond them, the terrain that had changed hands in the night. In the early light it looked like nothing in particular, just ground, just the surface of a world that had 17 million people in its shelters, and was still there to shelter them. "Your relief forces are 4 hours out," I said. "I know," she said. She wrote another line. "Will the shroud hold their position?" "They are evaluating," I said. "The cost calculus for Corps VII has shifted. They may determine that the resource value no longer justifies the operational investment required to overcome a reinforced defense." She nodded and wrote another line. "They will leave," she said, not a question. I had reached the same conclusion but had not yet committed to stating it with that level of certainty. "I believe so," I said. She wrote another line and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You want to ask me something?" I had been deciding how to form the question since 3:02 in the command bunker. I had carried it through the advance, and the shroud withdrawal, and the dawn, and the full casualty accounting. "I want to know what you call it," I said. "The thing your people do, the refusal, the quality I have been observing and cannot name accurately." She looked up from the notebook. "What do you mean?" she said. "Every species I have worked alongside in 41 years of military service has a threshold," I said. "A point at which the calculation of survival overrides the calculation of mission. It is not cowardice. It is basic operational logic. You commit to an objective until the cost exceeds the value, and then you redirect. You adapt to survive so that you can continue to function. Every military culture I have encountered operates on some version of this principle." I paused. "Your people do not appear to have this threshold," I said. Yusuf was quiet for a moment. "We have it," she said. "We just move it." "To where?" She thought about this carefully, the way someone thinks who does not use words as approximations. "Past whatever is in front of us," she said. I considered this. "That is not a location," I said. "That is a direction." "Yes," she said, as though this were the point. I looked out at the landing field. Thessaly was coordinating with the human unit's senior NCO, a tall man named Grant who moved through logistical conversations with the same unhurried efficiency I had observed in Yusuf. Near the second dropship, the young soldier, I had learned his name was Owen, was sitting with his back against the landing strut, eyes closed, in the same position I had observed the night before deployment. Not sleeping, the same thing he had done before. "Your soldier," I said. "Owen, he did that before your unit deployed as well, sat with his eyes closed." Yusuf looked toward him. "He always does that," she said. "What is he doing?" "He says he is making room," she said. "Before a deployment he clears space in his head, puts aside everything that is not the mission. He says you cannot carry extra weight into the field. I watched Owen for a moment. He was still young enough that the specific quality of his youth was visible in the way he held his body, not entirely relaxed, but not yet carrying the permanent tension that extended military experience builds into the frame over years. He would carry it eventually. I could see the beginning of it already. How old is he? I asked. 23, Yusuf said. 23. I had not carried a weapon at 23. I had been studying formation theory in a classroom. Owen opened his eyes, looked up at the sky over Chorus VII, and then looked toward the shelter building. He saw Yusuf. He made a small gesture with one hand, a brief acknowledgement, and Yusuf made the same gesture back. He looked back at the sky. He lost people, I said. Yes, Yusuf said. And he will do this again, I said. Yes, she said. She said it without performance, without pride or resignation. A plain acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge the fact of weather or the movement of a planet around its star. A thing that simply is. I looked at her. She had returned to writing citations, her pen moving across the paper in the same controlled rhythm. Colonel Yusuf, I said. She looked up. I have been in active military service for 41 years, I said. I have worked alongside 41 species. I have observed combat conducted by biological organisms, by synthetic platforms, by hybrid systems that do not fit neatly into either category. I have read every significant tactical and strategic analysis the coalition's combined military scholarship has produced regarding human combat performance. I paused. None of it was accurate, I said. She was quiet for a moment. In what way? She said. The analyses focus on your physiology, I said. Pain tolerance, endurance parameters, threat adaptation. They treat these as biological specifications, measurable qualities that explain your combat performance. They are not wrong about the specifications, but they are wrong about what the specifications come from. Yusuf waited. It is not biological, I said. Whatever it is not a physical property. It is a decision. It is something your people have collectively decided about the relationship between difficulty and continuation. She looked at me for a long moment. We decided a long time ago, she said, that the universe does not owe us a survivable situation, so we stopped waiting for one. I sat with this. Outside, the light was getting stronger. Chorus VII's sun was climbing over the eastern terrain, and in the light I could see the full scope of the previous night's battle, the changed positions, the terrain that had moved from one column of a tactical spreadsheet to another, the physical evidence of what 41 years of experience had assessed as impossible before it had simply happened. I need to file an after-action report for Coalition High Command, I said. Of course, Yusuf said. I will need to describe your unit's performance accurately, I said, which requires me to describe it in terms that have tactical meaning for the receiving audience. Yusuf nodded. What terms would you recommend? I asked. She did not answer immediately. She looked out at the landing field, at the soldiers working through the slow, necessary business of the aftermath, the logistics, the accounting, the careful management of what remained after what had been spent. Owen had stood up from the landing strut and was helping carry equipment from the second dropship. He moved with the same focused economy I had seen in everyone in the unit. No wasted motion, no performance, just the next task, then the next. Tell them, Yusuf said, that we are reliable. I looked at her. That is all, I said. That covers it, she said. She returned to her citations. I watched her for a moment, then I stood and walked back across the landing field toward the command post. Grant, the senior NCO, was organizing resupply distribution on the far side of the field. He acknowledged me with a brief nod as I passed. The kind of nod that means, we are in the same place, doing the same work, and nothing else needs to be said about it. Thessaly fell into step beside me as I approached the command post entrance. "What do we do now?" she asked. I thought about the question, not the tactical answer that was straightforward. Relief forces, refortification, shroud deterrence posture, civilian shelter status updates. That list had already written itself in my mind before she finished asking. I thought about the other part of the question. The part underneath the tactical surface that Thessaly, who had spent 17 hours expecting to die on this planet, was actually asking. "We do what is next," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "They are going to leave, aren't they?" she said. "The humans. When the relief forces arrive, they will be redeployed." "Yes," I said. "And go somewhere else," she said. "Somewhere else that needs them," I said. We went inside. I sat down at my station and I wrote the official after-action report. It was precise and detailed, and covered the tactical sequence from the blockade breach through the shroud withdrawal with the clinical thoroughness that Coalition High Command requires, and that I have spent 4 decades learning to produce. When I finished, I opened a second document. Unofficial, unaddressed, not formatted for any military archive or distribution system. I wrote it in my own language rather than the Coalition standard, because I wanted the precision that comes from a language you have spoken since, before you can remember. I wrote it for whoever came after me, for whatever commander would be given a situation like this, and would need to understand what they were working with before the humans arrived, and what they were working with after. I wrote, "In 41 years I have fought alongside 41 species, and I have never needed to issue a warning about an ally. I am issuing one now, not because the humans represent a danger to the people standing beside them, but because what they represent will permanently alter the framework through which you assess every other military reality you encounter." I wrote, "They do not come to a situation asking whether it can be survived. They come asking what it will take. These are not the same question, and the difference between them is not a matter of degree." I wrote, "They will lose soldiers. They will lose them in ways that would break the operational capacity of any other unit I have ever commanded, and they will not stop. They will not stop because stopping is not in the vocabulary they have built around this work. The vocabulary they have built contains words for difficulty, for cost, for loss, for grief, and it contains, at its absolute center, a single fixed point: the next thing will be done." I wrote about Owen sitting against the landing strut with his eyes closed, making room. I wrote about Yusuf writing citations by hand on paper, so they would be harder to delete. I wrote about 200 soldiers going into the dark toward 40,000, because the woman leading them had determined that 60 of them reaching the objective was enough. I wrote, "You will be tempted to explain this through physiology or training or the specific cultural conditions that produce human soldiers. You will be tempted because that analysis is available, and because it generates a conclusion that fits into existing frameworks. Do not file it there. File it here. Some species decide at some point in their history that the measure of who they are is not what they survive, but what they refuse to abandon. The humans decided this a long time ago. They carried that decision to Chorus VII. 17 million people were in shelters under this planet's surface because of it. I sealed the document. I assigned it a classification code that would route it to every coalition commanding officer likely to work alongside human forces in the next operational cycle. Then I looked at the screen for a long moment. There was one more thing to say. Not a tactical assessment, not a recommendation, just a single statement of what I had observed in the hours between the 4th defensive ring going silent and the dawn light coming across the terrain of a world that was, against every probability calculation I had produced, still standing. I added it as the final line of the document. Do not mistake the care they take with their people for hesitation. The hesitation is not in them. It never was.